Hello. Welcome in my home office, Frank Dikötter. Before moving to Hong Kong, you was professor of the modern history of China at the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London. Now you are chair professor of humanities in the Department of History in the University of Hong Kong. You have published several books and a lot of articles and chapters in books that have changed the way we look to the modern history of China. Your most great famine won the prestigious Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction in 2011. You are also senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and you hold an honorary doctorate from the Leiden University. Your latest publication, How to Be a Dictator, The Cult of Personality in the 20th Century, had been published in Germany by Klett-Cotta and translated by Henning Dedekind and Heike Schletterer. In our review on the blog of Klett-Cotta, we wrote, terror, constant violence, and omnipresent terror alone are not enough to become a dictator. The German subtitle of your books, Populism, Cult of Persons, and the Path to Power, shows that education is part of the technique of power, as despots can succeed in establishing a one-person rule that is founded on populism and personality. It is a one-person rule that oscillated between compulsion against the oppressed people and glorification of the dictator by the people. Do you agree? And which are the main points which are allowed to compare the difference of your 8 dictators mentioned in your study?
Yeah, I think there's one slight modification one might add here, namely that I mean, it's quite a common sort of mistake, but the personality of the dictator is not related to the cult of personality. I know it sounds rather complicated, but cult of personality really means the glorification of the dictator by the people. And it's a compulsory glorification. People don't have a choice. You must hail the leader. You must recite his work. You must applaud him and praise his genius at all time. And if you don't, the neighbor will denounce you. The police will take you away. You might end up in a labor camp or be shot, for all you know. So this is not related at all to the actual personality of the dictator. I think this is a mistake we make quite commonly. In fact, you could have no personality at all. Remember Stalin, for instance. You might very well talk about a cult of unpersonality, and that he never showed his true person in public. He always stood at a distance from the masses who had to adore him. He was very placid, stolid, rarely smiled, almost like a living statue. Ordinary Soviet people hardly ever heard his voice over the radio, unlike, of course, was the case with other dictators. So the point of the cult of personality was almost to hide the very person of the dictator, but make sure that everyone hailed him and adored him. Why? Because one cannot have a one-party state through fear alone. It is good for a dictator to police the streets, but it's even better if a dictator can police every mind. And that is achieved through the compulsory glorification of him by ordinary people.
You present 8 dictators in your book, and simple populism is always a carrier ad for the new dictators. Your book is very current because it is coming here at the time when populists in Europe are trying to gain influence. In this way, your book formulates also a warning against populism here.
Yes, it's a warning. It's basically a book that dictators can use to learn how to become a dictator. And it's also a book, of course, that we can read to make sure that potential dictators do not become dictators. But nonetheless, it is foremost a book of history. It's about dictators who are dead. And I understand and share the urge to be eternally vigilant, as the saying goes, in particular in democracies. But nonetheless, the subject is about one-party states. It's about regimes where there's an absolute monopoly over power by dictators. So that is quite separate, I think, from democracies. I think we should be concerned about trends in de-democratization that you can see in Europe and elsewhere today, but it would be dangerous to confuse that with the rise of dictatorships in the 20th century, which is altogether something very different and much more drastic and far-reaching than what we see today in Europe.
You have chosen 8 dictators in your book. Are they the cruelest, the ones who have the most similarities? Often it was a certain degree of populism which was realized they could consider to achieve the collection of power.
Yes. So how do you pick 8 dictators? Very difficult. You have a very simple choice. You either write about all of them, or you must pick a certain number. You know, why 8? Why not 7? Why not 9? Why not 12? I think the point is really to illustrate the extraordinary variety of dictators throughout the 20th century, from the Bolshevik Revolution to a reasonably well-off country like Germany in the 1930s, all the way to impoverished parts of the world in Haiti under Papa Doc Duvalier, and of course Ethiopian Mengistu. So once you understand and see that broad range of contacts and circumstances and dictators, then you start seeing some of these common points. And the commonalities are, of course, the use of fear on the one hand, with the spies, with the police, with interrogators, torturers, the secret police, but also the cult of personality, where people are compelled to adore the one who rules over them.
The personality cult is often denied by dictators. Mussolini pretended not to be interested in the beginning, and yet the cult around him was his own work. But he, as Hitler, quickly discovered how the cult of persons can help them on their way to full power. Power seduces everyone, the people also, like potential dictators.
Yes, so this is the extraordinary thing, is that Mussolini spent almost half of his time building up his own image and rehearsed in front of the camera, a little bit like Adolf Hitler, who had a photographer, as you know, Heinrich Hoffmann, who would take photos of him. He rehearsed as well. So they're great actors, and they really build up that cult of personality themselves. Although, of course, they had the benefit of huge ministries of propaganda and means available, like the radio, in some cases television, and of course propaganda more generally. But nonetheless, I think it's important to realize that we simply don't know how many people actually truly loved their dictators. The key point really must be that before 1933 in Germany, very few people actually adored Adolf Hitler. And after 1945, the moment he vanished, that love was gone as well. So it's very much, again, a context in which people are compelled to hail their dictator. And if you don't put up your poster of Adolf Hitler, if you don't listen to that radio program, your neighbors will denounce you, or someone else will come and lock you up potentially, or send you to a camp. So again, it's the fear that matters a great deal.
No politician can say, I want to become a dictator. There is always has to be a certain historical situation, a person in which the more or less expressed wishes of the people are bundled. What is the most important, the person or the stream of ideas? Could you give some examples?
Well, I think it's important to recognize, and I think we see this in the 8 examples I took. Of course, there are no failed dictators in the sense of dictators who try a coup and then fail. But nonetheless, it's important that we recognize that these dictators actually had many talents. It's the sort of Charlie Chaplin image of Adolf Hitler, or Stalin's portrayal by Trotsky as some sort of caveman Georgian is, of course, a very far cry from the truth. These were people who had gifts that we may not like, but that must be recognized nonetheless. And surely the greatest gift they had was to use both luck and unluck, to use opportunity to promote themselves and their careers, to seize opportunities even when things went wrong. There's nothing like a failed assassination attempt in the case of Lenin, for instance, in the case of Mussolini, to somehow have the dictator use it to assert more power. So it's that ability to seize opportunities combined with luck that really makes a dictator, among other things.
Yeah, luck and unluck, but the struggle for power, the elimination of competitors, the effort to appear as benefactors for the people and the search for the right moment are other elements for a dictatorship. Stalin succeeded in combining them.
Yes, absolutely. The point, of course, is that a dictator is somebody who does not go to the ballot box. He has not been elected. In other words, he seizes power through coup or by rigging the system in his favor. Now, the problem, of course, is that when a dictator seizes power, it raises the prospect of someone else doing the same thing against him. Somebody else could stab him in the back and seize power in turn. So a dictator must be eternally vigilant. And the greatest fear is not just of the population at large, but the greatest fear of a dictator is of the people who are immediately around him, his own entourage, ambitious people who might wish to push him aside or depose him. So there's only one way forward here, and that is to purge and purge and purge. It can be done in a bloody way, as we noticed in Germany in 1934, or under Stalin later on in that very bloody decades, or it can be done through, if you wish, a more peaceful way, like Ceausescu in Romania, who would constantly rotate all the people who were important in government to make sure that they never acquired a power basis. But the key point for a dictator is to pay attention to those around him. He must keep tabs on number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, constantly try to find out what kind of plot is going on.
There's another aspect, the followers, the fear of competitors, of assassinations, or simply that his clique, his followers could abandon him, is omnipresent and can only be countered by terror. Any dictatorship is not possible or successful without terror.
Yes, and this is the great contradiction, of course, with the cult of personality. With the cult of personality, when you compel people around you, all the way to ordinary people in the street, to acclaim you, to praise you, to hail you as a great genius, then in effect what you are doing as a dictator is turning them into liars. And there are benefits to this. When everybody lies, nobody knows who is telling the truth, and it becomes very difficult to organize an opposition against the dictator. But on the other hand, the dictator is also a victim of the system, and that he can't trust anyone, since all of them are sycophants, liars. He can't really truly trust any of them. So he must consider them to be potentially dangerous. And it helps, as they often do, in particular in the case of Duvalier, if a dictator can not only purge his enemies, but also make mistakes and get rid of his friends before he purges his foes.
Dictatorship is always combined with staging the power, as it began in China in 1948, but this is also right for all the other said dictators.
Yes, it's all about performance in public. It's all about, Adolf Hitler said it in an unguarded moment, I am Europe's finest actor. And of course, Mussolini himself viewed himself as a great performer as well. There's a great theatricality involved here. The world is a stage. But most important, of course, is that you must fool the ones around you, much as they tried to fool you. You as a dictator have turned them into liars, but you must lie even better than they do. You must fool them. And that's what you must be a great actor indeed, that nobody really knows what you truly and really think, that you keep people on their toes, second guessing what it is you have in mind.
Just like Mao should be revered as a leader by everyone in 1958 because of the truth in his hands. Any objection was punished. In 1946, Kim Il-sung has managed to be described by the writer Hen Soya-as as our son. It's quasi a sort of religion.
Yes, so it is interesting. It is not a religion, but it's interesting to compare it to religion. The most striking point here, you could talk about Mussolini using very Christian values of piety to turn himself almost into a saint, with the hope of a healing touch in Rome, with religious icons with his image on it. But what is even more interesting, besides Adolf Hitler, Duvalier, Mussolini, dictators on the right, is the communist dictators, because of course communism radically eliminates all religion which it sees as superstition. But the problem inherent to Marxism is that it is a philosophy which doesn't exactly appeal to a great number of people in the countryside who are largely illiterate. They do not comprehend the philosophy of dialectical materialism. So in that sense, from Lenin onwards, all the way to Mengistu in Ethiopia, communist leaders understand that it is much more effective if they can portray themselves as quasi-religious leaders that will have much greater appeal than the dry philosophy of Marxism-Leninism.
Often dictators have never been born to establish tyranny. We quote Francis Duvalier, who was elected president of Haiti in 1957. He and actually all other dictators use favorable circumstances to almost appear in the name of the people whose supposed benefits in order to ensure their approval. A legal way to dictatorship?
Well, Duvalier, again, is exceptional. I did emphasize in the beginning that they have talents. And one of the extraordinary things with Duvalier is that he is a minor figure who does not have the backing of the army, a party, a newspaper, any organization of any kind. This is really a man on his own who presents himself at the elections and manages to convince the military who preside over all of this, manages to convince them that he really is a man without much ambition, a man that they can trust and of course manipulate. And within a year of being elected with the help of the military, Duvalier uses the military to get rid of all his opponents, and then of course purges the army. So at the end of 2 years, he is the one to reign almost on his own over this small part of an island. Quite extraordinary.
The people accept to be oppressed, but the end of the dictators always come as soon as there's some hope in the people again, when the illusion and the spectacle of power is understood by the people, when it begins to doubt, when the omnipresence of the ruler faltered, that he can only rule with great effort, with the people and the cult of personality paired with violence and oppression, and yet his end will always come.
Yes, well, we never know, of course. The point about dictators is that they portray themselves as somehow, like the statues of themselves, very, very solid. But these statues do get toppled in the end. And that end comes sometimes very rapidly in a very unpredictable way. This was certainly the case with Ceausescu in Romania. Hitler, of course, we know. Mussolini was hunted down and killed and hung upside down from a girder.
But Mussolini lost his power by an election, by a decision of the parliament.
Of course, he was placed under arrest by the king 2 years before the end of the Second World War, then rescued by Adolf Hitler, who could bear the idea of a dictator somehow being deposed and arrested. but all of them ended rather badly. There are a few exceptions, I think. Mao, of course, his portrait is still there on Tiananmen Square. And in the case of Duvalier, François Duvalier Père, Papa Doc, he of course passed on power to his son, a baby Doc, although he failed after about a decade. But the best example is probably Kim Il-sung, that we now have a third generation of the Kim family in charge in North Korea. Extraordinary endurance, although we know that that too must come to an end at one point.
I have two last questions to stress this point of the end of the dictatorship. It is exactly that exaggeration, too much terror, the oppression becomes too strong. The dictator shows the weaknesses, which nourishes his people's hope for freedom. Dictator are aware of this danger of the rule?
Yes, I think that's exactly it. Too much fear, too much oppression, and it causes malfunctions. But what is also very interesting, certainly in the case of Hitler, and I guess to a less extent Stalin, who was much more in control, is that as a dictator surrounds himself with liars and sycophants, and he can no longer trust them, he increasingly must make all the decisions by himself. So the danger of making the wrong decision, of a misstep, of a miscalculation, becomes all the bigger as the dictator accumulates power. So that's the inherent contradiction of the dictator, is that the more power he has, the less he can trust others, and the more decisions he must make, opening it up, of course, to major mistakes. Of course, you can make a big mistake and still get out of it. For instance, Stalin's pact with Hitler was a major mistake. He miscalculated in a huge way. Still, the Americans came to the rescue. The Soviet Union prevailed. There are other examples, of course, in which it is a failure at one point by the dictator to understand what is happening and to take appropriate action that leads to his downfall. I think the best example probably is Ceausescu, when he gives a speech just before Christmas 1989 to people assembled in front of the party quarters, and doesn't quite realize that he's being shouted at and booed, and he loses his composure. He loses his confidence, and people feel that frail state. And that's the moment where the Romanian Revolution starts. And this is being transmitted live, and television, of course, is shut down at that moment. The screens go black, and everybody understands that the people are rising up against this dictatorship. It's literally a matter of minutes.
My last question is underlines what you have said. The clusters of offices, president, general secretary, commander-in-chief, leader of youth, are never enough for the dictators. They always want to strive for higher things and sometimes do not realize that the bow has long been overstretched.
Yes, absolutely. It's not just an accumulation of power and the titles that come with it, but there's also this sort of extraordinary greed for more power to consolidate the power they already have, more titles, more objectives, more superlatives to describe them. And of course, Ceausescu was utterly obsessed with the titles that he was given by foreign universities, at home, abroad, elsewhere. He collected them. He spent much of the morning going through the newspapers and trying to find out what was said about him abroad. He collected titles.
Mm-hmm. Cult of personality always rhyme with fear. Dictators has also fear?
Yes, of course. Again, the fear of being overthrown. The fear of the stab in the back. The fear that people might do to him what he has done to others.
Thank you very much. Your book, Dictator werden, has been published by Klett-Cotta in Germany. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.